All right, here's a little fucking cheat sheet for you. It's never gonna be me and you and your sister and Shine fucking playing house up there. All right? You got it? Get that in your fucking head.
For years, Ben Affleck wasn't just criticized in Hollywood, he was openly laughed at. He became a punchline in late-night monologues, internet memes, and tabloid culture. His movies were mocked, his relationships dissected, and his personal struggles turned into public entertainment. What made it worse was that this wasn't a struggling actor trying to break in. This was someone who had already won an Academy Award, starred in massive blockbusters, and seemed destined for long-term success. The question wasn't how Ben Affleck failed. It was how someone with everything going for him became one of the most ridiculed stars of his generation. Affleck was born in California but raised in Massachusetts in a working-class environment shaped by instability. His father struggled with alcoholism and drifted in and out of the family's life, while his mother worked as a school teacher and encouraged education and discipline. He grew up around different worlds, intellectual influence at home, and chaos just underneath it. Acting entered his life early, not through glamour, but through educational television and local opportunities. As a teenager, he appeared in PBS programs like The Voyage of the Mimi, gaining experience without celebrity. Around the same time, he formed a lifelong bond with Matt Damon, another young actor from Cambridge who would become inseparable from his future. By the mid-1990s, Affleck and Damon were trying to survive in Hollywood as struggling actors. What separated them from most was a decision that changed everything. Writing instead of waiting. Together, they wrote Good Will Hunting, a script loosely inspired by their lives and communities. The project was rejected repeatedly before finally being accepted, rewritten, and produced. When the film was released in 1997, it became a cultural event. Not only was it a critical success, but it earned the duo an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. Overnight, Ben Affleck was no longer just an actor, he was a respected creative force. Hollywood reacted quickly. Affleck was offered leading roles in big-budget studio films and positioned as a new mainstream star. Movies like Armageddon, Pearl Harbor, and The Sum of All Fears made him globally recognizable. Studios trusted him to anchor massive productions, and audiences responded at the box office. On paper, his career appeared unstoppable. But commercial visibility came with a shift in perception. Instead of being viewed primarily as a writer and artist, he was reframed as a conventional leading man. The deeper credibility he had earned began slipping beneath the surface. The turning point arrived in the early 2000s. A combination of poor script choices, overexposure, and relentless media attention began eroding his image. Films like Daredevil and Jersey Girl were met with lukewarm responses, but nothing damaged him more than Giggly. The film failed critically and commercially, and quickly became symbolic of everything critics claimed was wrong with his career. At the same time, his highly publicized relationship with Jennifer Lopez dominated tabloids. The term "Bennifer" became unavoidable, and Affleck stopped being treated like an actor and started being treated as celebrity content. As the media attention intensified, so did the backlash. His engagement, his breakup, and even his personal habits became daily headlines. The public narrative shifted sharply. He was framed as someone who wasted his talent, made bad decisions, and could no longer be taken seriously. Box office disappointment piled on top of critical ridicule, and the jokes grew louder. Underneath it all, Affleck was struggling privately with alcoholism, an issue rooted in his childhood and amplified by fame. Rehab became public knowledge, further fueling the idea that his career was in decline. By the mid-2000s, Ben Affleck's credibility had collapsed. Other actors from his generation were rising or stabilizing into reliable careers. While he was increasingly viewed as Hollywood's cautionary tale, studios hesitated to trust him with major roles. Media outlets openly questioned whether he was finished. For many, it seemed like the perfect arc, a gifted young writer who couldn't handle success. That perception ignored one critical detail. Affleck hadn't stopped working, he had stopped chasing validation. Instead of trying to win back popularity, he began quietly shifting direction. In 2006, he appeared in Hollywoodland, portraying actor George Reeves, another figure destroyed by fame and public misunderstanding. The performance was restrained and controlled, earning him serious critical praise and signaling that something had changed. He followed that by stepping behind the camera. In 2007, Affleck made his directorial debut with Gone Baby Gone, a grounded crime drama set in Boston. The film was disciplined, morally complex, and well-received. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was deliberate. This marked the moment his fight back truly began. Not through headlines or apologies, but through control. Ben Affleck stopped trying to prove he was likable and focused on proving he was capable. The world would take longer to notice, but the comeback had already started. After Gone Baby Gone, the immediate reaction wasn't redemption, it was hesitation. Hollywood doesn't forgive quickly, and one well-directed film wasn't enough to erase years of mockery. But it did something more important. It reset how Ben Affleck was viewed behind closed doors. Studios and creatives began seeing him less as a celebrity liability and more as a disciplined storyteller who understood character, tone, and restraint. He followed this shift deliberately, choosing projects that distanced him from the image that nearly destroyed him. In 2010, Affleck directed and starred in The Town, a tightly constructed crime thriller centered on Boston bank robbers. The film was sharp, commercially successful, and critically respected. More importantly, it proved that Gone Baby Gone wasn't a fluke. His direction showed confidence, control, and a clear understanding of tension and pacing. By this point, the narrative around him had changed quietly, but decisively. He was no longer being discussed as a fallen movie star trying to recover. He was being discussed as a director building a body of work. That transformation reached its peak in 2012 with Argo. Based on the covert CIA operation during the Iranian hostage crisis, the film balanced political drama, suspense, and character without unnecessary spectacle. Affleck directed, produced, and starred, but avoided turning himself into the emotional center of the story. Argo became both a critical and commercial success, culminating in the Academy Award for Best Picture. While Affleck was controversially not nominated for Best Director, the moment still represented a full reversal of reputation. Less than a decade after being mocked as a symbol of Hollywood excess, he stood at the center of its highest honor. Yet redemption didn't mean stability. Even as Argo confirmed his legitimacy, Affleck's personal struggles resurfaced. Alcoholism, something he had battled for decades, remained a persistent issue. Public perception swung again when he was cast as Batman in the expanding DC film universe. Online backlash was immediate. Social media campaigns mocked the choice before footage was ever released. The reaction wasn't about the performance, it was about the memory of who Ben Affleck used to represent. Once again, the past followed him. Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice arrived in 2016 amid extreme expectations and division. The film succeeded financially, but split critics and audiences. Affleck's portrayal of an older, broken Bruce Wayne was widely praised, but the surrounding franchise chaos limited the impact. Behind the scenes, production stress, creative conflict, and relapse took their toll. A candid interview clip showing him disillusioned during a press tour became viral, turning into the sad Affleck meme. Once more, his internal battle was transformed into external comedy. The difference this time was awareness. Instead of forcing himself to power through, Affleck stepped away. He exited his role as director of the Batman reboot and focused on recovery. The decision was framed publicly as creative, but it was largely personal. Unlike earlier in his career, he didn't try to hide it or spin it. He entered rehab again, openly acknowledging the consequences of addiction and the cost of fame. Where earlier narratives painted him as reckless or unreliable, this honesty began reshaping how people interpreted his setbacks. In 2020, Affleck returned with The Way Back, playing a former basketball star struggling with alcoholism. The parallels were impossible to ignore. His performance was controlled, vulnerable, and stripped of ego. Critics noted that the role didn't feel like a comeback attempt, it felt like a confession. This marked another shift in how he approached his work. He stopped trying to outrun his history and instead allowed it to inform his choices. Subsequent performances reflected that maturity. In The Last Duel, he portrayed a morally compromised medieval noble with uncomfortable authenticity. In The Tender Bar, he played a complicated mentor figure shaped by bitterness and regret. Neither role relied on charm or spectacle. They relied on presence. By this stage, Affleck wasn't chasing leading man dominance. He was choosing characters that mirrored his understanding of failure, ambition, and consequence. Parallel to this on-screen evolution was a more strategic move off-screen. Alongside Matt Damon, Affleck co-founded Artists Equity, a production company designed to give filmmakers and actors greater financial and creative ownership. This wasn't just a business pivot, it was philosophical. After decades inside the Hollywood machine, he moved into a position of control rather than dependency. The same industry that once dictated his image no longer defined his career. What ultimately separates Ben Affleck's story from typical redemption narratives is persistence without reinvention theater. He didn't dramatically rebrand himself. He didn't distance himself from his past. He endured it. Each era of ridicule, from giggly to tabloid obsession to internet memes, tested whether he would collapse under public scrutiny or evolve beyond it. Instead of fighting perception head-on, he redirected his energy into skill, discipline, and long-term influence. By the early 2020s, the laughter had largely stopped, not because everyone suddenly loved him, but because the argument against him no longer held. His body of work spoke louder than his mistakes. His failures were visible, but so was his refusal to be defined by them. Ben Affleck didn't win his fight back by convincing the audience he was likable again. He won by proving he was durable. When the ridicule fades, what remains is trajectory. And his tells a clear story not of uninterrupted success, but of survival. Inside an industry that rarely allows second chances, let alone third or fourth ones. By the time Ben Affleck entered his 50s, his career no longer fit the simple rise and fall narrative that once defined him. What mattered less was which movies succeeded or failed, and more how consciously he now approached his work. The early version of Affleck had accepted Hollywood's definition of success, visibility, box office dominance, and cultural relevance at any cost. The later version understood that staying in the industry long enough to shape meaningful projects required restraint, boundaries, and personal accountability. This evolution became clearer as he increasingly stepped away from the spotlight and leaned into collaboration and production. With Artists Equity, Affleck and Matt Damon set out to restructure how films were made and how profits were shared. The company emphasized transparency, performance-based pay, and creative involvement from the people actually making the films. For Affleck, this wasn't a pivot driven by trend or ego. It was a logical response to decades spent watching creative control drift away from those who carried the emotional and professional risk. At the same time, his on-screen choices reflected a man no longer interested in competing with his younger self. He avoided roles designed to win back audiences and instead leaned into characters that were flawed, compromised, or morally ambiguous. These performances didn't generate the loud cultural conversation his early blockbusters once did, but they were consistent and respected. He had stopped measuring success by headlines and begun measuring it by sustainability. Public perception lagged behind reality, as it often does. For some, Ben Affleck would always be tied to memes, tabloid excess, and very public mistakes. But the industry itself had quietly recalibrated its view. Directors trusted him. Studios funded his ideas. Actors followed him into projects not because of his celebrity, but because of his experience navigating failure and rebuilding trust. That internal respect mattered more than internet approval. Affleck's personal life also followed a more measured rhythm. He spoke openly about sobriety without framing it as a victory lap. Instead, he treated it as ongoing work, something maintained rather than conquered. This honesty removed the illusion that his comeback was clean or dramatic. It was ongoing, imperfect, and conditional. That realism distinguished him from many celebrity redemption stories that rely on reinvention narratives rather than accountability. When discussions about his legacy arise, they are no longer framed around individual mistakes or viral moments. They focus on range. Few modern figures have moved as fluidly between writer, blockbuster actor, tabloid figure, commercial failure, director, producer, meme, and respected veteran all within one lifetime. His trajectory exposed the brutality of Hollywood's attention economy, where public favor can reverse overnight and recovery is rarely encouraged. What makes Affleck's arc notable is that he never convincingly fit the role Hollywood attempted to assign him. He wasn't naturally wired for perpetual charm or publicity-driven relevance. His strengths lay in structure, revision, and long-term thinking qualities that take time to be recognized and often clash with immediate fame. The ridicule he endured was less about incompetence and more about misalignment between personality and expectation. Over time, he learned to stop resisting that misalignment and instead work around it. He stopped auditioning for cultural approval. He allowed the gap between public perception and private growth to exist without trying to collapse it through explanation or performance. That patience is rare in an industry designed to reward visibility over depth. Today, Ben Affleck occupies a space that few actors ever reach. He is not chasing stardom, nor is he fleeing from it. He is present without being pinned down by it. His mistakes are documented, his struggles public, and his comebacks incomplete by design. And yet, his career remains active, influential, and self-directed, the clearest indicator that his fight back succeeded on his own terms. The laughter that once followed him was rooted in certainty, the certainty that he had peaked, failed, and run out of chances. What his story ultimately disproves is that certainty itself. Careers don't always end when narratives say they should. Some bend, fracture, and continue forward in quieter forms. Ben Affleck didn't erase his past or outgrow it. He built around it. That is the difference between survival and victory. Victory requires applause. Survival requires endurance. Ben Affleck proved he was capable of both but chose the one that lasts longer. And that is why the star everyone once laughed at is still standing, long after the laughter itself moved on.